Okay, I'll start it now. You're still getting back.
Mine is on my account anyway. Mine's on my student account.
So yours was this one, yeah?
Yeah.
I'm going to put it on just have it, okay?
So Lucy Hall is up, right?
Okay, I'm hoping some's going to actually work, but we shall see. Oh, do you need to provide
It's just
my
easy to just take the pen, thank you.
Then we...
I'm in between, so I haven't done the total. I can do it after.
Is that yours, Tal? Yeah.
Yeah, just got to ignore.
Okay. Okay, so I'd like to start by playing you a bit of a song. I'm hoping.
Where did you get that? Where did you get that tile? Isn't it a naughty one and just a proper style? I should like to have one just the same as that. Wherever I go they shout, hello, where did you get that hat?
Okay, so I'm sure that you're all aware that the topic for my presentation is going to involve looking at the hat making trade and material related crafts. And these were trades which were extremely popular during the 19th century. So I want to begin by looking at the significance of millinery and material related crafts as a trade that was acceptable for women to engage in. But I'm also going to argue that in many cases, such modes of employment may not have been a preferred alternative to domesticity for many women. So during this period, there was a high demand for hats, both for daily wear and for formal occasions. And so millinery very much became an important profession during the period and for periods to come, and today it still thrives. But I think most importantly, it was a profession which could be held by women, hats made by women for women. And the process of hat making would typically involve a milliner either going to a lady's house to take measurements. That was very much a mark of class. And a lot of villages and towns would have had a milliner's shop which was run by women and staffed by women. Now, according to this report of 1842, in London alone, 15,000 women, most of which were about 16 or 25 years old, were employed as dressmakers and milliners. And that was a large proportion of the population. But you might be wondering why women were permitted to engage in this type of trade, particularly given kind of the cult of domesticity which prevailed within society. And I think at this point it'd be beneficial to give you some context about the way society viewed women. Now, there was this ideology that women were expected to remain in the private sphere. And this is something that Reid alludes to in her essay, A Plea for Women. She says, women's duties were comprised in good humour and attention to her husband, keeping her children neat and clean and attending to domestic arrangements. And this is also something that Anne Elliot refers to in Austen's Persuasion, when she says, women in the early 19th century live at home, while men of her class have always a profession. But despite this ideology, times did change and thought started to shift. And Austen does hint in Persuasion that women's role in society had to alter. And this was for many reasons, perhaps because they were increasingly put in the position of having to support themselves. And many of them did really desire for purposeful and fulfilling work. And this is something Barbara Lee Smith claims in her essay, Women and Work. She says that many women wanted to remedy the political and social inequality that they were faced with. Now, as I've suggested, although women were excluded from certain occupations and activities, they were able to enter into new ones. And millinery and needlework was very much considered a decent and respectable employment for women. and it was considered something that they were capable of doing. And as Alison Cayley claims, she says that it was a little enterprise which could secure for its proprietor many things. An income that could be woven around domestic commitments, independence, and a measure of respectability, the preservation of her home and household, and a retirement strategy. So for women, there was very much a sense of belonging in this trade, and I suppose it was seen as a natural profession for them to occupy. And the very existence of a milliner's shop, which was run and staffed by women, meant that in a way the public and the private spheres could be united. And it marked the early stages of women as consumers and producers. And it would have been highly appropriate for many women to engage in this kind of activity, because virtually all women would have had the necessary experience to be doing needlework. And indeed, engaging in such material-related crafts as a profession or as a hobby is something alluded to in Austen's Persuasion, and it's particularly alluded to in the section of the novel which is set in Bath. And I think Austen's language very explicitly describes the nature of Anne's obligations and occupations. There were some things that she could and couldn't do in the society in which she lived. So, for example, in chapter 6, it says, chapter 10, Charles Musgrove and Captain Wentworth being gone shooting together, as the sisters in the cottage were sitting quietly at work, they were visited at the window by the sisters from the mansion house. And I think it's suggesting here the type of activity they're probably engaged in is sewing. And like millinery, it was an activity which trained women to conform to the standards of quiet and patience, whilst the men were able to go off and do as they pleased. And indeed, there were certain social hobbies and tasks that Anne's permitted to do, such as her piano playing and entertaining. In chapter 6, it says, while her fingers were mechanically at work, proceeding for half an hour together, equally without error and without consciousness. But material-related crafts are also exploited as a means of livelihood in Austen's Persuasion. And I was very much thinking about the character Mrs. Smith, who I think is one of the most resourceful women in the novel. And she states that her finances at that moment were particularly unfit to meet any extraordinary expense. And so she goes on and she engages in needlecraft. And she says, as soon as I could use my hands, she taught me to knit. That's Nurse Rook taught me to knit, which has been a great amusement. And she put me in the way of making these little thread cushions, pin cushions, and card racks, which you always find me so busy about, and which supply me with the means of doing a little good to one or two very poor families in the neighbourhood. And I think doing this kind of activity suggests that Mrs. Smith enjoys the work. She says that it's been a great amusement. And at the same time, she's able to yield some power and some kind of capital from her ventures as well. Now, I've entitled this slide, Who Wants to be a Milliner?, which is a slight play on words, but it is a question fundamental to the argument that I want to kind of propose. You know, although women worked, was employment really a preferred alternative to domesticity? Well, according to McKethan, she says that many women actually preferred to remain within the boundaries of the private sphere, and that they were actually happy there. They were quite empowered by their domesticity because it provided outlets for action and for confidence building, particularly through its emphasis on duty to educate their children and to serve others. And indeed, this is an idea raised in the critical essay Memories of Miss Jane Porter by Mrs. S.C. Hall. And she describes the happiness of the woman who retains the unpublic life. And she says that the woman would have been happier had she have continued enshrined in the privacy of domestic love and domestic duty, and that she knew of a woman who drew all happiness from the lovingness of home and friends. And this suggests that there were women who were very much satisfied with their roles as mothers and wives, and they didn't see being in the private sphere as domestic kind of tedium. But not only this, it suggested that a trade-off kind of took place. And what's meant by this is that women might very well have been happy to accept the rule of their husbands in return for perhaps security, material comfort, and protection. And indeed, this is alluded to by Barbara Welter, who quotes a woman from the 19th century who reveals her defence about why she wants to remain in the private sphere. And she states, St. Paul knew what was best for women when he advised them to be domestic. There is composure at home, there is something sedative in the duties which home involves. It affords security not only from the world, but from delusions and errors of every kind. So I think it kind of poses the argument, you know, if women were protected in their private sphere, why would they have wanted to leave it? And in relation to this, I found a couple of texts which I'd kind of recommend for further reading, and that I myself am going to look into a little bit more. And that's How Husbands May Rule and Peculiar Responsibilities of American Women, because they kind of suggest what women can gain by remaining under male's authority and within the private sphere. So just really to round off, I think women in the 19th century were able to engage in particular occupations, such as millinery and material-related crafts. And for many women, this is what they wanted. They wanted to leave the domestic round and pursue different activities. But I don't think that this notion can be generalised to all women. And as I've described, you know, many of the women actually preferred domesticity to being part of a workforce, because it would have provided them with a sense of security and a sense of some material comfort as well. And so they had perhaps less of a desire to leave the private sphere. And I think in a way, both of these perspectives are still very much upheld by women today. And that's just a couple of good things.
Thank you very much, Lucy. You've talked about the acceptable face of millinery.
Yeah.
Have you looked at it from the other side, the unacceptable face? Have you looked at what actually happened to milliners?
No, I haven't. I mean, I've sort of looked at how it sort of progressed through the 19th century and what it kind of, how it moved into being something that could be done in the home, something that was done in a shop, and then how it moved into kind of factory work and how there was different demand. But I haven't actually looked at it from, you know, whether millinery, what actually happened to the women who were doing it.
So in this presentation, you're just giving us the domestic version.
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. Because it's worth considering just what awful life milliners had.
Yeah.
But definitely they were safer in the home.
Right.
But yeah, no, that's great. Thank you ever so much, Lucy.
Thank you very much.
Anybody else got any questions? No?
Is it okay if I ask a question?
Yeah, of course it is.
I just wonder whether you thought whether there was a distinction between sort of rural life and city life, and
What, and how kind of like millinery and material
Yeah.
crafts.
yeah.
I think in the rural particularly, I know that initially there was quite a lot of anxiety and worry about women kind of opening and running milliner's shops. I know I looked at Gaskell's Cranford, and there's a bit in there where I think she's opening a tea shop or something,
Yeah.
and
Well, within
Miss
her own
Matt-
house.
pardon?
Within her own house.
Yes, and I think Miss Mattie's a little bit sort of worried about the kind of implications and, you know, the kind of shift from being just in the home and in, you know, in the private sphere. And I think in the city it was, I guess it was kind of, they desired to have kind of milliners in the city more. I mean, there were a lot of people, this kind of bespoke tailoring and things like that were very, a lot of people desired to have, you know, hats made for them, and particularly, you know, for special occasions and things. And I think, I know women, particularly in London, in the West End, where a lot of millinery was prevalent, I think, that contributed a lot to London's economy at the time. Women, you know, making hats, and you know, women had to have a lot of skill and expertise in order to do it. So I think there were definitely sort of different ideas about millinery, but I think, yeah, I think different ideas. But
Okay, Lucy, thank you.
Okay.
Thank you, Sophie.
um,